Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode. Today with me, I have Dr. Chad Bogosian. Thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me again. It's always a pleasure to be with you and have good conversations with you.
Yes, definitely. And today I feel like it's a pretty big topic. Feel like it's a really, actually, really not only kind of personal but existential type of deal or topic that has kind of been discussed for thousands of years. So before we get into our topic, if you don't mind reminding our listeners who you are and what you do.
Sure. Yeah. Again, thanks for having me on the show. And my name is Chad Bogosian. I'm a philosophy professor full time at Clovis Community College in Fresno, California. And I'm starting my 8th year at the college. And I regularly teach classes such as Intro to Philosophy, Ethics, Honors Ethics, Critical Thinking, and a host of other really interesting classes. And I love that I get to teach and engage students on these kinds of questions like we're discussing today. The God question that we're discussing today is something that comes up in my Intro to Philosophy class, where we look at arguments on either side of that debate. But yeah, that's what I do full time. I'm also a father of two lovely children, and love being involved in their lives and helping coach sports and all the rest of it. So life is very full, and I love that I get to think about these questions and stuff that has been very interesting to me for many years. And like you said a minute ago, I think it really how one thinks about these things has a way of shaping how they live. And so I think that's one of the reasons I find so much value in thinking through these things together.
Yeah, definitely. And so I think this is a perfect segue into our topic, which is an argument for God's existence. And so this is kind of general structure of it is more of a, well, does God exist? And do we have reasons to believe that God exists? And what could those reasons look like? And in this particular argument, Chad, if you don't mind outlining it and just kind of giving a general background of what we'll be talking about. And yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I do want to say for the listener's sake, in terms of how I think about these arguments for God's existence. So I'm going to be defending a type of argument called the cosmological argument. And I think as a theist, I tend to think of these as there's not one that's like a knockdown, drag out, that moves one from agnosticism or non-theism to the theistic side. But I do think that this argument that I'm looking at today, we're going to focus on one, can be one among of what we call a cumulative case, a set of arguments that can provide a good rational basis for believing in the existence of God. So the one I'm going to unpack with you today and work through is one of the handful that I find compelling, and I think there are many others as well. And there are other versions of this type of argument that other philosophers defend, but I'm going to defend one that's called a contingency argument. And it's a deductive argument. And what that means in logic is if the premises are all true, then the conclusion has to follow with necessity. So it's a logically necessary conclusion. And to be a rational person, one would accept the conclusion. So if one wants to deny the conclusion, they would have to find one of the premises to be false or faulty and provide counter arguments for that. And we'll consider some of those today, which is what we typically do on your podcast and as a way of reasoning through, as you say. So that's how we're going to go at it today. So we'll set up some key definitions that'll show up in the argument. The general structure is I'm going to kind of do some ground clearing to define some important terms. Then we'll set out the argument in the logical steps. I'll explain those, and then we'll look at 3 kinds of objections that are most common against the argument, and then I'll provide replies to those as we go.
Perfect. All right. So yeah, let's just jump right into it. So yeah, if you want to start, I guess in some sense, defining some terms before we kind of move on to the argument.
Yeah, great. So there, just to give a little bit of a quick background. So a cosmological kind of argument goes all the way back to Aristotle, and that might be called a classical type of cosmological argument. The one I'm giving today is a contemporary type of argument, and it relies significantly on a causal principle called the principle of sufficient reason. And that principle says that a fact, no fact or statement can be true unless it has a sufficient reason for why it is so and not otherwise. All right. What this is getting at is that there's an important distinction between two kinds of things or beings, things that exist: contingent and necessary. So real quickly, I want to define, these terms are going to come up often today, and so I want to define them at the outset, and then we'll reference them again and use some examples. So a contingent being is a being, or contingent event is something that relies for its existence, its occurrence, on something else independent of it. So it's dependent on something else. A contingent being, by definition, isn't a being that can be fully explained or understood by referring to itself. So by way of a general example, if I ask why I exist, I could not have existed. I didn't have to exist. This is pretty non-controversial. But to explain my existence, I have to refer to, two biological contributors, let's say at least, that contributed to my coming into being. So my existence and an explanation of my existence is dependent upon their existence and activity. Okay, so that's contingent for the time being. Now, a necessary being is a being or event that does not require other beings independent of itself to explain it. It can be fully explained either intrinsically or by referencing its own qualities and attributes. But the crucial thing here is twofold. One is it's not dependent on other things for its existence, and it's the explanation of its existence. And number two, a necessary being could not exist, right? So it has to exist. So that's a really strongly different kind of thing than a contingent being, right? Contingent beings, it's easy to imagine a world, as we philosophers say, where I didn't exist. The world could have been a little bit different, and then I'm not here for all the relevant reasons. And that could be true for you or for any other person, or for your sweet pet that you have at home, or for your house, or for our country, and out it goes, right? Those are all contingent things that, had the world been a little bit different, they might not have been. A necessary being, on the other hand, has to be, and it cannot not be. Now, those are important. And so what how that's going to tie into the principle of sufficient reason is I'm going to use, there are different versions of the principle, and just in the interest of time, I'm going to use, my argument relies on what's called a moderate version. So a strong version would be something like anything that exists has to have a cause for its existence. That'll become obvious later why the argument doesn't rely on that strong of a principle. A weaker version would be something like, it's possible that every fact has an explanation, but that's too weak because it only says it's merely possible that there's an explanation, but not that there really has to be one. And so I'm going to kind of cut in between those. And the version of the sufficient reason that I like is, it says that what is contingent, so whatever is contingent or what comes into being, requires a sufficient reason for why it exists or comes into being. Now, someone might ask, well, why think that that's a good principle, right, to explain scientific phenomena or anything else? Well, if you think about it, just sort of the pragmatics of our explanation. Aristotle said we humans by nature desire to know. We want to know things, and knowledge oftentimes requires that we explain what we encounter. And so to explain things like a contingent being, we're not just wanting to say that it's here, right, that I exist. That tells me the what, or what kind of thing that I am. We want to explain the why. Sometimes you hear philosophers in this discussion say, ask the question, why is there something rather than nothing at all? And we could make that narrow to talk about like kinds of things. Why are there humans at all, right? Not just why do I exist, but why are there the species humans, right? Or we could go all the way out to the universe, and we'll get there eventually today. Why is there a universe as opposed to no universe? Okay, so in our explaining of things, we typically want to have a full explanation of things. We can give a partial explanation, right? We could say, well, hey, Chad has two parents. that contributed DNA, biological parents, and that's why he's here. Okay, that explains a lot about me. But does that explain everything about why I'm here? No, not necessarily, right? We might appeal further to the intentions of those biological contributors, right? That they wanted to start a family and that they wanted to have a certain number of children, and that the reasons they wanted to have those children pertain to having a good, meaningful life or something like this. So once we drill deeper, we see that there's not only uh, a desire for full explanations, right? But full explanations can include different kinds of explanatory posits, right? They could be persons, they could be impersonal causes. And so all of this stuff will become important as we get further into the argument as we go. Last ground clearing, and then you can feel free to jump in here. Just to reiterate, a partial explanation would kind of pick out a causal condition, like this event or these processes. This event is explained by certain processes, but that doesn't tell us why there are these kinds of processes that operate on certain kinds of things. Okay, so we're going for, in our discussion today, we're going to ask questions like, can a partial explanation of the universe explain the universe? Yes or no, why or why not? If the answer is no, well, then what more is needed to get a full explanation? And why, as I'm going to argue, we want a full explanation of the universe's existence, and why that's more plausible than the alternative of just saying a partial explanation will suffice. And so to then give the last pairing of distinctions here, a scientific explanation, we rely on these all the time. They're very important. They give causal conditions, tell us what, right? Plus the laws of nature operate at a given time for an event to be likely to occur. That's great as far as it goes, but we're going to ask again, can a scientific explanation provide an account for why there's a universe? Yes or no, why or why not? Or do we need some kind of personal explanation that refers to the intentions of an agent? And like I referred to earlier about human persons, sometimes we can explain things in terms of just the biological phenomenon question, but other times we need to know the intentions of the agent to have a full, complete explanation. So generally what I'm going to do with the argument that I'm going to lay out is I'm going to argue that the universe is contingent, and it needs a non-contingent explanation to explain why it's here at all. And to fully do that, we're going to need to go beyond naturalistic causes to have some kind of personal, non-natural necessary cause for its existence. So that's the general structure. And when you're ready, I'll be happy to articulate the premises and the argument.
Yeah, no, I feel like it was at least clear to me that you laid out everything. One, so pretty much just to kind of recap, I guess, for some people, where you have the principle of sufficient reason that's kind of underlining a little bit of the argument. And it's more of a moderate version. It's not necessarily that it's possible or that there is for everything that exists, there's a cause for it, where you have more of a moderate version of that. And then, yeah, we understand what contingent mean, which is that it's something that can, in some sense, fail to exist. It doesn't have to exist, but it's dependent on something else. So, I didn't have to be born. I just am, but I'm born because of my parents. Then we distinguish between the scientific explanation, which is, in some sense, it's like you can explain like how biological like procreation can come about, right? That'd be like some type of scientific explanation. But then why specifically would, let's say, two parents want to have a child? That you're going to have to put in some type of other explanation that has to do with some type of intentionality between the two. Well, because they wanted a family, or they want to have a children, they want to have a child, things like that, to give a different, maybe not a different, but maybe a more full explanation or fuller explanation between the two.
Yeah, if I could just add something in here on what you're saying. Another way to say this is, like in the sciences, in this discussion, philosophers are interested in explanatory power, we might say. We want an explanation that has full explanatory power and doesn't sacrifice any explanatory oomph, so to speak, right? And so it may be that we need a personal, to refer to the intentions or purposes of persons to have explanatory power. And I think, like even in the case of bringing children into the world, I think that's a fairly good example for the time being where, sure, you can explain procreation in terms of biochemical processes, but I would argue that you can't reduce, in every case, childbearing just to those biochemical processes. There's more going into why you exist as a child or I exist. At least in my case, I can say this. And it's going to require reference to the purposes of my parents and intentions in bringing about myself as one among the three children in my family, to sort of their goals for life, and to have the explanatory power is lost if we try to reduce that down to firings in their brain or other biochemical processes that, strictly speaking, give us a purely physical account of procreative processes. And so what we're saying here is that in many cases we can go far with those, uh, talking about those processes to explain things, but we don't have full explanatory power. We're going for explanatory power in those cases, as well as today in the case of explaining the universe's existence.
Yeah, so it's kind of like so I this is before we get into the argument. So I was just thinking of this question here and kind of what do you think about this? Um, when it comes to explanations of things, do you think that there's a distinction to be made with something that may be occurring naturally, like some type of natural phenomenon, versus, and then so you have an explanation about maybe, so for example, like this, the water cycle, right? We could explain it in a very naturalistic way and explain why there's a water cycle and what occurs, and then you have an explanation there, scientific explanation. Now, you may not be able to do that. Let's just say, for example, you may be able to try, or you can try to do that with, let's say, in our example of procreation and parents creating a child. Do you think that is because one is, I'll make this distinction here. One's agent, like some type of agent causation, whatever the case, versus something that's just non-agent causation type. So you have and contrast that like with the water cycle. So would you say that's kind of like that's why you need a little bit more explanation in one rather than the other? Because I guess in some sense it seems like there's an open question when it comes to like for example, like why did I have a child with my wife? And then I can explain that in a scientific way, but then you probably would still think like, well, okay, but why did you want to have a kid, right? So then you have that question there that seems open, rather than like if I explain the water cycle to you, it doesn't really seem. It seems that that would be more of a closed question where it's like, well, why is there a water cycle? Well, here's why the water cycle happens.
Yeah. So I think that's great, and I think I typically like to take these on a case by case basis. Kind of what's called a particular approach to talk about the particular thing. I think the water cycle is a great example in the following way. So, sure, could we give a naturalistic story of that? Sure. And no one's disputing that. I think, but then where that may not be sufficient is what if there's a particular instance of the water cycle that uh, personal beings, right, agents have had something to do with setting up a water cycle of sorts to water grass, or to have water fountains, right? And again, I'm speaking in really generic terms here. I know that this isn't exact, but again, if there's an instance of a water cycle that's not just the general conceptual thing we're talking about, right, sort of in a vacuum, where now human beings are involved, right? We want to account for that particular instance. To account for it adequately and fully, we're going to not just be able to reference the general. This is the, I don't know if I like science. I think persons are science, part of the scientific, but okay, I'll stick with your distinction. So the scientific naturalistic account, or the non-agent causal account, yes, you're going to need an agent, I think, to fully explain the particular one in certain instances. Now, and zooming out even further, as will become clear in our discussion today, I think why there are water cycles at all, that exist, cannot be fully explained by referencing the naturalistic process. We can explain naturalistically water cycles, but not why there are water cycles at all that can be given a naturalistic explanation. And so the why there's the set, or why there's the thing, kind of thing, which water cycles are contingent things, I think is going to require a non-contingent explanation that is necessary and personal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. No, that's what I was just curious because it does, definitely seems like you have those questions there. So now, in some sense, it opens like when we're talking about like the universe and why is there something rather than nothing. Simply just pointing. Let's just say I said, well, maybe there's some naturalistic explanation. Someone can just say something like that. But then, does that really fully account for why this rather than nothing? So, but anyway, set that aside right now, I guess, or we'll leave that on the table, and then we'll kind of get to the argument because that will be kind of more fleshed out as
Yes,
we
yes, it
continue.
will. Yeah, that'll come back up as we go. Okay, so here's the deductive argument, cosmological argument from contingency. Um, and just real quick, there are versions of this that are inference to the best explanation kinds of arguments. At the very end, I'll say something about why I think God is the best personal explanation. But strictly speaking, the argument I'm giving is not a best explanation argument; it's a deductive argument. So here we go. Premise one: a contingent being, that is a being which, if it exists, um, can not exist, right? It could not have exist. So there's at least one contingent being that exists. Premise one. Premise two: this contingent being has a cause or explanation of its existence, and that's basically the causal principle of sufficient reason. Premise three: the cause or explanation of this contingent being's existence is something other than the contingent being itself. Premise four: what causes or explains the existence of this contingent being must either be solely other contingent beings, so like in the case of the parents explaining you, or include a non-contingent necessary being. So that leaves open that a full explanation of a particular contingent being could be both contingent beings and non-contingent beings, or necessary beings. Okay, premise five: contingent beings alone cannot cause or explain the existence of a contingent being. Therefore, conclusion one: what causes or explains the existence of this contingent being, which of course we're going to focus on the universe mostly, being that contingent being, must include a non-contingent necessary being. Therefore, a necessary being, that is a being which, if it exists, cannot not exist. So a necessary being exists. All right. So what we're going to try to establish is that a necessary being exists to explain the contingent being, the universe. The premises are intentionally general to leave open talking about other kinds of contingent things, but of course we're trying to argue that the universe is a contingent being, right? And it's pretty, I think, safe to say the bulk of cosmologists and philosophers agree it's a contingent being. It didn't have to exist, and so from there, then we're looking at for a cause or explanation for its existence, and what the conclusion of the argument, what we're trying to get to, is that it can't be the universe itself can't fully explain the universe. Things within the universe can't fully explain the universe's existence, and so we need something independent of the universe to explain the universe, which is contingent, and that's going to be a necessary being that needs to explain it. All right. The central premise of contention that gets attacked the most in this argument is premise five. So to repeat that, that's the premise that says contingent beings alone cannot cause or explain the existence of a contingent being, in this case, the universe. Okay, so contingent things can't explain the universe. They're not sufficient to explain the universe. All right. There are lots of noted philosophers in the history of philosophy who have gone after this premise. Bertrand Russell is one of them. He's one of my favorite philosophers. We have, as will become obvious, disagreements on things, but he was a very sharp mind. Who some people may be aware of his book, Why I'm Not a Christian, but he wrote just a ton in professional philosophy. And he went after premise five, and he argued that it's false on a couple grounds. Number one, he said, well, look, we can just posit that the universe is what some call a brute fact. A brute fact is just like saying the universe just is. It's just here. Sir, we know that, but that's all that can be said. It's worth pointing out here that's not an explanation of the universe. That kind of gives up the explanatory game, and he's fine with that. He accepts that, but he just says, look, the most we can say is here, there's a universe here, and that's all there is. Now, how might he justify that? He justifies that move by saying a couple things. One is he says, typically when we look at a cause and effect relationship between things, we infer things about a cause by observing its effect. So we observe some event or someone like you or I, and then we extrapolate or we infer some things about the causal, the things that brought it about, right? But we can, at least in theory, go find out, right, hunt down, if you will, the causes for the kind of effect in question. The problem is with the universe, we can't do that, right? The universe is here, call that a super important big effect, but we can't, in theory, go experience, right, what brought it about. And so since we can't go experience it, it's kind of beyond, if you will, the empirical method where we get, repeatability and verifiability and that sort of thing. So I'll put this out here because I'll come back to it. Bertrand Russell is working in part in a philosophical tradition called positivism, and positivism is the idea that the only kinds of things that can be known, or that only statements that are meaningful, are those that can be verified by the hard sciences. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So logical positivism, as it was called, would then rule out all kinds of things like religious statements can't be meaningful because they can't be, proved within the scientific method or falsified. It might also have a problem for certain moral statements and so on. Okay, he's applying it to the universe as a whole. We can't go out and find the cause, experience the cause. We can't duplicate the universe coming into existence. So it just is. The other side of this coin, his critique, is what he calls the fallacy of composition. This is a common informal fallacy that people commit all the time. And it basically says that what's true of the parts of something is not necessarily true of the whole thing. So, one example here of the fallacy would be, certain parts of my body have a certain weight. But it doesn't follow from that my entire body weighs the same as the certain parts of the body. So if one part of my body weighs 5 pounds, it doesn't follow that my whole body weighs that. Or if each part weighed 5 pounds, the whole thing doesn't, right? That commits the fallacy of composition. Now, he's saying that theists, people who believe in God and like the contingency argument, are committing this fallacy because they're saying, well, look, parts of the universe have causal explanations for their existence. Like we talked about, human beings are explained by something else. Okay. But it doesn't follow from that the whole universe has a causal explanation. All right. These are interesting. What might be said in response? Here are a couple of responses back to Russell's objection. First of all, we might say he's right? The part-whole fallacy is a legitimate fallacy, but sometimes the fallacy is committed when someone attributes things that are true of the parts to the whole, but not always, right? Sometimes what's true of the parts of things are also true of the whole. For example, let's suppose we walk by a brick wall. If I say something like, all the bricks in the wall are small, therefore the wall is small, that would commit the fallacy because it's not true, right? It could be a very large brick wall, very tall, 10 feet tall or something. But what if I said, on the other hand, the wall is made of bricks, therefore this is a brick wall? Well, that's a whole kind of way of reasoning, and it doesn't commit the fallacy, right? It's legitimate, and that's because at least one feature of what's true of the wall, namely that it's made of bricks, gives us the justification, or by comparison, it's true that the wall is a brick. Now, the theist is looking at that second example that I stated about the brick wall and saying that's what's going on with the universe, where what's true of the features of the universe, namely that whatever we find in it, at least in principle, can have a causal explanation, right, given principle of sufficient reason. It's a sensical question to ask, well, why is there a universe? And that calls out for an explanation for the universe as a whole. And that's what we're looking for here, number one. The second response is, here's kind of a way of maybe kind of flipping the script, so to speak. Let's suppose we take all the parts of the universe and make them one big set. And we simultaneously, if we had the power to take all of that, everything in the universe out of existence, well, then the universe would cease to exist at that point, right? That gives us a good reason to think conceptually, right, that if that's possible, then the universe, number one, is contingent, right? It doesn't have to exist. It could not have existed. Number two, it gives us a reason to think that the universe needs to have an explanation for the entire set, not just the members of the set, but the entire thing, why there's the set that we're calling the universe as a whole. Let me pause there and ask if you have any questions, or there's something I need to clarify to make sure we're.
Yeah, so I think I think the latter example is probably stronger in response to the charge of being a fallacious reasoning. Um, because I you definitely have those counterexamples, and then I guess it comes down to, at least for the fallacy of composition one, kind of which one is it? Is it the parts? Are we trying to appeal to the parts to explain the whole, or are we attributing the properties of the parts to the whole? Um, is it one case where it's like I'll use the brick wall example where every brick is small, therefore the wall is small, kind of thing. Is that how the universe is, or is it um, the every part is every part of the wall is made out of a brick, therefore the wall is made of bricks? Is it that kind of reasoning? I feel like there is. So I would be happy with modifying. I know this is a modification of the
Yeah, go for it.
of like the PSR, principle of sufficient reason, where instead of using like some type of causal explanation, it seems as if you can still ask, right? So like in the latter example, with removing things from the set, because we're looking at what explains the set of contingent things, that all that exists. If we gather all contingent beings or all contingent things, what explains that set? I think that's what gets modified, which is that contingent things have an explanation of things, rather than maybe not. It's not necessarily. I don't. It doesn't seem to me like that would be a causal principle. I'm using just saying like there are things.
It's an explanatory principle. That's probably a better way to say is it's an explanatory principle,
Yeah.
not one of cause and effect. I think a lot of times, if what you're going for here is people think of cause as, A made B happen.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, what I think I hear you saying is we're looking for how to just explain that you've got the set, right?
Yeah, and it seems like that.
What you're saying? Am I hearing you right?
Yeah, it just seems like I think if you go that route, I feel like the charge of being a fallacious reasoning doesn't really apply to it anymore, because we're not using the property of the parts to explain the whole. We're just saying, okay, look, there things happen in this world or in the universe. These are the parts, but what explains the whole part? Or what explains the whole set? And and I feel like that's different. I don't feel like that would be like a fallacious reason to be like, okay, well, we can explain the contingent things, but does the whole have an explanation? And I don't feel like that's a property of. I don't see that as a composition fallacy. Maybe perhaps it is, but it seems as if that changing the principle of sufficient reason in that kind of sense seems that you still have the explanation of, well, why is there something rather than nothing?
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because the principle of sufficient reason sometimes is called the causal principle, but again, how the word cause is used here can just be interpreted as, or can mean explanatory principle. We're explaining things, and not in a direct causal effect, but really giving an account of why something is the way it is, or occurred the way it occurred. And so, like, even in the case of human beings, right? If you explain each member of the human species, there's still a meaningful question of why there are human beings at all. Even why within an evolutionary framework, right? I think there's a meaningful question to be had there. And so there we're asking for an account
Mm-hmm.
of the existence of the kind of thing, of the whole collection, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now that's a limited, I think, analogy, but it's an analogy to, I think, what you're saying about the universe as a whole. And I agree with you. I like the second response. I think it's stronger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it doesn't seem like it just doesn't seem like it'd be a fallacy or fallacious response. So like, I mean, maybe this is a little simple for, at least for me, where it's like, I think going back to, like the human example, but so I'll use sheep's. That's a little easier for me. But like, okay, every sheep in the herd has a mother, but like the herd itself doesn't have a mother. Okay, right? That'd be, and if to say that there is a mother would be the fallacy. But if you reframe it where it's like, okay, well, every sheep has a mother, every sheep in the herd has a mother. Okay, but then what explains why sheep are there in the first place, or why they exist? That's a totally separate question that isn't charged of, like, doesn't seem fallacious. Or I don't think.
Why sheep have mothers? Is it possible?
There you go.
It's possible they didn't have mothers, right?
Exactly,
that might. I think arguably that's a contingent feature of let's say being a sheep, right?
Yeah. And so so then that's where the charge about being fallacious, I think, kind of stops.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I agree. Well, if it's okay with you, I'll move to the second objection.
yes.
Well, let me say this real quick. There is kind of a second wave of attack Russell has, that's, I guess, part of this first objection, And I'm going to not get in the weeds here in the interest of kind of the audience, but I want to mention this because people ask this, and it's a good question. Russell and others might have said things like, well, look, maybe we could have things that exist that lack a causal explanation because we look at like electrons or things at the subatomic level that appear to pop into existence uncaused. We know that they're real. We can even experience that with a really powerful microscope or what have you. But it does. So in other words, it doesn't follow, right, that everything. This is a way of kind of going after PSR, so to speak, right? All right, and maybe the Big Bang is like this. The Big Bang event is a kind of a subatomic event, and it's small. And among the things that have no causal explanation, the Big Bang doesn't need that. Maybe if you want to bring that into the discussion. Okay, well, there are a couple replies here, and I'll just kind of put these out there. There are three of them. Number one, it's possible, right, that our lack of knowledge of explaining how the things at the subatomic level come into existence, maybe our lack of knowledge here is due to limits in our investigative equipment. Okay, maybe we will eventually have an explanatory account, and that's a possibility. Number two, indeterminacy at the subatomic or quantum level isn't the same thing as something being uncaused. It's still caused, or could be caused, right, or have an explanation, but it's indeterminate, right, or underdetermined, or something like this. And number three, it's possible that we just don't know which laws of physics, for example, apply to the early stages of the universe, of the Big Bang, or however you want to tell the story there. And it's possible that the causal principle, right, is something that could be applied if we have more information to account for the beginning of the universe. So those are some pushbacks to kind of his second wave. But if it's okay with you, I'm going to go to the second objection because I want to be sensitive to time. Yeah. All right, the second one, I think, in the first one objection is really fascinating to me. The second one I think is really interesting too, because this delves a little deeper into the part-whole issue, the parts of something and the whole, and explaining either of those or collectively. David Hume, Scottish skeptic David Hume, said something like this. He said, look, once we explain the contingent parts of the universe, which we can do, right? We've explained the universe. He honestly used this type of objection to criticize William Paley's watchmaker argument, which is a different argument than I'm giving. But people have kind of repurposed it here, and they'll say, look, we don't need a necessary cause to explain the universe as a whole. Once we've explained scientifically the contingent effects of everything in the universe, we're done. The explanatory buck stops there. All right, there are a couple lines of response to Hume's objection. Here's the first. Number one, it's not necessarily true that explaining the parts of the universe provides a full explanation. It can provide a good explanation, but this is true not only of the universe. This could be true of something else, right? We could have an incomplete explanation of natural phenomena by just appealing to the parts of that thing. Here's an example that I like. I find helpful, at least. Let's suppose I walk outside and I see pieces of rock laying around. And then I look over to my right and I see a sledgehammer. And I go, oh, okay. I make a quick sort of inference that, well, maybe the sledgehammer has been used here to break apart some larger rock, and that's why there are pieces of rock. Okay, well, could explain, just without going any further, that would be a plausible explanation of the environment, that there are rock pieces lying around because the sledgehammer was used to break up some larger piece of stone or rock to make these smaller pieces. But let's suppose I take a few steps further down the trail and I see a pile of rock pieces. Now, just explaining the pile of rock pieces by reference to the sledgehammer would be incomplete. Why? Well, because it might be necessary for us to bring into the discussion, the explanatory discussion, something like persons. We might ask, well, how is it that these rocks are assembled or arranged in a pile, in a collection? And now as I look on the trail and I see maybe two people, right? Let's say they're, I don't know, prisoners who are doing community service for the community. and I go, okay, now I ask a question of these two people. Why is that pile of rocks over there? And they say, well, hey, prisoner two used the sledgehammer to not only break up the rocks, but to assemble them into a pile because that's what he was told to do. But notice there, what I have is a series of bits and pieces of explanation that appeal to agents, as you said earlier, persons that are intentional, conscious beings that set out to accomplish certain goals, right? They're very purposive in their aims, and we need to reference those aims and the persons who have those aims and their intentions to explain why we have a collection of pieces of rock. And it's incomplete and insufficient to just reference the sledgehammer to account for the pile. By analogy, I think, or just by this can be leveraged, I think, as a response to Hume here, that it's not the case even in naturalistic explanations, where when we explain the parts, right, the rock pieces and the sledgehammer, that's sufficient to explain the whole thing, right? We need something more. Here we need a personal explanation. A personal explanation brings with it, intention, purposiveness, and so on. Do you want to ask any follow-ups on that? I'll go to the second reason, or you can circle back around if you want later too.
No, God, you can keep going.
Okay, the second response to Hume's objection here is to ask a question in terms of what do we explain the parts of anything, but in our case, for our argument, the universe. Okay, we're trying to explain the universe as a whole. We've got a couple options here. We can explain the universe in terms of the parts, okay, and the parts are explained in terms of themselves. So this would be like the example of me explaining my existence by referencing myself. Is that possible to do? Well, no. I need to appeal to something other than myself, right? But if I explain something in terms of itself, that's just what we're calling a necessary being. A necessary being can't fail to exist. It's not dependent on anything outside of itself to explain its existence. But I'm not a necessary being. I'm a contingent being, precisely because to explain my existence, I need to appeal to things outside of myself. Now, the question is, if we're applying this to the universe, one option here is we can explain the universe by referencing the universe and things within it, okay? Or we can explain the universe in terms of something else, right? Outside of the universe, some other contingent thing, or some other necessary thing. Now, here's the thing. For me, okay, in my view, asking a question like, why is there this collection of things that we call the universe? It cannot be fully explained by appeal to things within the universe, right? Because what we end up with is either a regress of contingent causes, or if we try to stop it at the universe itself is contingent and can't fully explain itself. And so we need to explain, we need something independent of the universe. And so here, some people might be tempted to cite someone like Stephen Hawking, for example, who is noted for saying things like, well, maybe there are pre-existing conditions that can naturalistically explain the universe as a whole. And there was a cosmic tiki torch that got sort of lit, and that's how you get a Big Bang event and this sort of thing. The problem with that, as others have pointed out, is that we're just invoking further naturalistic contingent stuff, right? Those aren't necessary. The cosmic tiki torch and the pre-existing conditions. I guess you could try to say they're necessary, but that's going to be a really difficult thing to maintain. Typically, those are understood to be just further independent causes, independent of our universe, right? That there are themselves natural contingent causes. And so now we've just pushed the explanatory buck back a step. And so I think what's more plausible here is to explain the entire collection in terms of something necessary. Not we can't do it with something else that's contingent, because we're going to then have to explain why that contingent thing has the ability, let's say, the power to bring about the universe. And then we're back to kind of square one and saying, well, we either need something contingent or necessary to explain that thing that brought about the universe. And again, I think we're off to the races again, and we've made no progress. So let me pause there, and then I can kind of bring it full circle to explain or reiterate that objection, the response. But if you want to have some dialogue there, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah. I don't think I have much to say other than I agree that at least as of right now, when I think about Hume, um, can the parts of something explain the whole of something? Um, and I find that I don't know, I don't think I'll make a specific response, but it's more of like, you can think about it like this way and see I just
Yeah.
want to see what you think about this. So, okay, so typically I'm going to put like like explaining the parts of the contingent, explaining that, and then how, if we can explain the contingent parts, we can explain the whole. Um, and then giving a counterexample to that, kind of something that you did, to explain like why that's not always the case or why that can't be the case. Do you think that it reminds me a little bit of people like William Lane Craig and others that want to say that the past can't be infinite? So going back in the past direction cannot be infinite because it leads to paradoxes or absurdities or contradictions. And they'll give some examples like the classic, like Hilbert's Hotel, right, to show that there's some type of metaphysical absurdity or some type of contradiction that's there. And then, but others have noted as saying that it may be the case that some examples of infinity might be contradictory or, in fact, absurd, but they would note that it doesn't follow that all kind of cases of infinity have that kind of example or follow from those contradictions. So that kind of points back to a little bit of Hume, where it may be the case that there are some examples that you cannot appeal to the contingent things to explain the whole, but would you say that it follows then that no example of explaining contingent parts explain the whole?
Okay, yeah. So to reflect that back, I think you're asking, and this is a great question. I think you're asking, is it possible that, like, if the example I gave is a good counter to Hume, that he
Hmm.
hasn't given us a general principle that applies across all cases, that uh, you know, once the parts are explained, the wholes are explained, the whole thing is explained. So I've given you an example where that doesn't always hold, but maybe
Hmm.
there are some cases, right, where the parts of the thing do explain the whole thing.
Hmm.
And I'm inclined to say, sure, that's possible. But what this argument, and I think that's consistent with my argument, this contingency argument, I think leaves open that it's possible that some contingent things could be explained in terms of fully explained in reference to their parts.
Hmm.
Okay, something like that.
Hmm.
The deeper question for us today is, can the universe
Hmm.
be explained by reference to its part? I'm suggesting that the answer is no.
Hmm.
Uh, I can come back to your thing if you want about Craig, but so this argument isn't relying on that issue as his Kalam does.
Hmm.
Here, what I'm going for is, given the kinds of things, the kinds of contingent things that we'd have to reference to explain the universe,
Hmm.
and I'm going to get to this, come back to this later.
Hmm.
It looks like the universe as a whole, not only that it can't be fully accounted for in reference to those contingent things, but how we could have this type of universe with these kinds of contingent things, like this whole collection,
Hmm.
requires something at least independent of the universe to fully account for it. And then we're I think, at the stage of then going, well, could that be another contingent thing?
Hmm.
And I'm happy to entertain what some candidates are there and then talk through those. I don't think there's another contingent thing that can adequately do it, such as Hawking's kind of counter, this sort of thing. But I think then it's going to be better to say that there's some kind of necessary being that explains something that doesn't rely on anything, that can explain such a thing as the universe, this collection, this whole thing. Uh, and that's going to provide, and this is deviating a little bit, it's going to provide a better explanation for the
Hmm.
universe than just appealing to the contingent things. But in terms of just the deduction of it without going to the best explanation yet, it's just to say, well, the explanatory buck, why there is a universe rather than no universe, and why there is this particular kind of universe, it doesn't seem to me, at least, that it can be accounted for, or that we've even accounted for it by referencing its contingent parts.
Hmm.
But then that's going to leave open that it needs a necessary explanation. And then I would add to that necessary explanation needs to include a personal explanation. Richard Swinburne is someone who makes this
Hmm.
sort of case, and I'm sympathetic to his kind of argument, right? It needs to include, the explanation is going to include intention, purposiveness, right? and I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but later, I'm going to say things like when we look at features of our universe, like that it's comprehensible and that it's, I think is beautiful and uh, people can find meaning in life and this sort of thing. Those sorts of contingent features of the universe, I think, uh, a full explanation is going to require an appeal to a necessary personal agent
Yeah.
rather than a contingent, dependent, impersonal agent.
Mhm.
And I'm open to being pressed on that. But that's kind of where I'm going here with Hume. So yes, grant Hume's point. Some things can be explained, wholes can be explained in terms of their parts, but I think in the case of the universe, that can't be done.
Yeah, and that's kind of where it goes into what you said earlier, which is like, so you have the two. You have one side that says like, okay, well, like the contingent parts can't explain the whole, and then you have another counterexample. Then another person might be saying, like, well, hold on, there are some cases where it's possible that some contingent parts will explain the whole, and then it kind of goes into what we're talking about with the broader discussion about the universe and kind of, well, what reasons do we have to think in favor and for against? And both parties, I would say, probably have to give their own motivations and at least are the reasons
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
for each. My second question was that, so going along, this is going back to the principle of sufficient reason a little bit. So let's say one grants the 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 PSR that was stated earlier about how um, contingent things have causes, and those causes are explain kind of the those contingencies or the contingent things. There's another causal principle, or maybe just something that we also can observe. So when we're looking at the universe, there are things that are contingent, such as you and myself, that we would say fairly non-controversial. But they would also say that things are also made out of material, right? So there's certain things that are made, right? We're made out of things, physical things, atoms, and those atoms are made out of, tiny protons, neutrons, and those like kind of those really. When we get down to the microscopic level, this is kind of what things are made out of. So there's also a causal principle that's at play, or maybe not even a causal principle, but some type of material principle, for lack of better, or physical principle, where things are made from other things. When we're applying that to the universe, if we're saying that, if we're using that, if can we use that same causal principle to say, well, it has to be something either naturalistic or material outside of the universe that made the universe. I don't know if that makes sense, or if that's my. I don't know if that was poorly worded or not.
I was with you, I think, until that last part. Are you asking,
So
can a
so
person just say, well, why not have, why can't we just appeal to purely materialistic
so
cause to explain the material universe? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, so something like that. So right now, everything in the universe that we can see, I don't know if this is. I feel like this probably could be controversial, but like or is made out of pre-existing stuff. So for example, we're made out of certain material. Other material comes from other material. Um, what I'm saying is that if we're looking at the universe as a set, and then we're asking what explains that set, and we're saying, well, it can't be anything within the universe to explain that set. But everything in but what we know of from the universe is that material comes from other material.
I,
Um, would
Mhm.
there be no material? Are we committed to a principle where we're going to get a non-material coming from material coming from a non-material, where that would commit us to something like that? Um, and so, yeah, what do you think about that? Or I don't know if I worded that properly or correctly. Um, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. So if the question, yeah. So again, I'm thinking too. I think if the question is, can we just sort of have material all the way down, so to speak, right? Where yeah, we've got this universe, material universe, but we've got a principle like material stuff brings about other material stuff, and so our universe is explained by appealing to other material stuff that predates the existence of the universe. Is that kind of what you're going for with the appeal to um, uh, kind of Hawking's sort of
Yeah, like so.
existing?
I'm trying to explain. So I know I'm trying to I'm not trying to I'm trying to go with our discussion of how we've been wording things. So if, let's say, this argument is successful, the one that you put forward, and there has to be some type of non-natural explanation, something like
Yeah.
that.
Yep.
Non-natural explanation is like kind of the conclusion of it. but everything in our universe, someone might say like, well, we have naturalistic explanations already, and as like a general principle,
Mhm.
that's the explanation. So here's a causal principle that I'm giving you. It's naturalistic. If material comes from other material, things like that. Um, can one reject the argument by saying like, well, it can't be non-natural. It can't be a non-natural material thing because everything, our principle will, I don't know, it contradicts the
Yeah,
principle.
okay, I see. So here's what I think I'm inclined to say, and then feel free to follow this up. I'm inclined to say if they try to replace PSR with some kind of, I don't know, it sounds like, material material causation is doing can do all the work we need it to do. The trouble I have with that, I think, so I'm gonna go stay within the language of this argument, and I'll step outside of it. So within the terms of the deductive argument I've given, the real question is the material stuff that's explaining the universe coming into being, is that contingent or necessary? And so if the I think the person would have to claim that their causal principle can pick out necessary material stuff or beings that, and then I would be need an argument for that. I want to hear that. I want to hear how that goes. And I'm not. I think that's fair, right? So, and if the answer is well, no, it's just other contingent material uh, that predates the universe or exists prior to the universe, or however you want to word it. Well, then we're still back to the drawing board, right? Say, like I said, to Hawking's thing,
We're
because
still
now
back to
the
the
question is,
visors.
how do we explain not the material principle, but the principle that's being invoked to sort of get one out of PSR, or get the implication that PSR could open the door to uh, a non-natural cause, right? So, or another way I would come back at it maybe is to say, can the material explanation that's being used to explain the universe provide a full explanation for the universe? So PSR by itself, I don't think is doing all the work here. It's just saying there metaphysically, right? There are two kinds of explanatory uh, posits that can be brought in to provide either a partial or full explanation.
Hmm.
And the concern that this argument has is that the universe can't be given a full explanation by only appealing to contingent causes. Whether those here, I'll put this. I would be happy to say whether those contingent causes are natural or non-natural. So contingent non-natural causes. So I'm intentionally not saying supernatural yet,
Yeah.
because take a non-natural, a non-material cause. Let's suppose, I don't think this is the case, but let's suppose numbers or some abstract objects could bring about material stuff.
Hmm.
Those are not, strictly speaking, non-natural
Hmm.
causes, and arguably, well, depending on your worldview, those could be contingent things. Let's suppose you believe that numbers came into existence, with the universe when the Big Bang brought about the universe or something. Okay, well, those are contingent, non-natural causes, but they don't. I would say the same thing. They can't fully adequately explain the universe as a whole. So that doesn't get the non-materialist, right.
Hmm.
That's not. I don't think that's not a route I think a theist should make. I don't think that's gonna do enough work. So it's not just that we're trying to open the door to something non-natural. It's that we need a non-contingent.
Hmm. Hmm.
I think we need a non-contingent being to fully explain the universe, and
Hmm.
that's a necessary being. Now the question becomes, what kinds of things, attributes, and qualities does the necessary being need to have?
Yeah.
I don't know how you, and I'm trying to think about this and consider it. It doesn't seem to me that, I guess one could say that you could have a necessary material cause. Um, I'd be interested to hear a candidate for that.
Hmm.
That's logically possible, but I don't know if metaphysically how that would work, right? Because material, given that principle, it seems like, well, that material thing would then be brought into existence by another material thing. And part of where this argument is going is that the explanatory buck stops with a necessary cause, whatever kind it is.
Hmm.
Um,
I think lastly,
yeah, go ahead, jump in there, please.
I think one at least lastly is that if we're looking at the set of all things, and they're granted there are certain properties that the universe has, right? At least we can just like the space and time, and typically when it comes to causes and effects, there's a spatio-temporal kind of relation between the two, right? So it seems as if one could also reject some form of a causal principle, or that at least relies on some type of. So what I'm thinking of, like, um, can a cause really be? Is it meaningful to even talk about a cause when time? So if we're looking all the way back from the Big Bang, kind of essentially, let's just use that kind of model right now. Does it make sense to say anything about anything to happen prior to that? When if from the Big Bang on is when time existed, or when space and time kind
Yeah.
of are occurring. So is it meaningful to say that there is a cause of something um, prior to, like, space and time? I know that might beg the question against causation about someone who may not subscribe to, because when I think of causation, I think of, like, there's some type of spatio-temporal relation between the two. And if there's no spatio-temporal relation between a cause or two events, between a relation between two events, then it doesn't seem. I'm not trying to use, like, positive language, but I don't know if that I don't know how to explain how that would happen, or that would explain. Unless you have to opt for, I think Craig opts for some type of simultaneous causation, but I'm just saying.
Okay, so this would be a question just generally. I mean, so that same sort of question, it strikes me, would, if I'm understanding you right, would apply to your previous question about material stuff being the explanation of the universe, right? Because
Hmm.
uh, I'm glad you brought this up. This is interesting because, like, even when I think of like Hawking's kind of stuff, and I'm not sure what he says on this, to be fair to him, but he talks like this stuff existed before, right?
Hmm.
That is a time language, right? That's
Hmm.
it implies some kind of locution, right? It's here, now, or before. But if time did come in, maybe he doesn't think. I don't know what he thinks of if time came into
Yeah.
existence at the Big Bang. That's a pretty standard view for atheists and theists alike, actually, in understanding if you uh, rely on Big Bang cosmology to account for at least the beginning.
Initial state of the universe.
Yeah, yeah, right. So it strikes me that your question would apply in
Yeah.
either camp here. But
Mhm.
I think one thing that might be said is, uh, there is no before. So I think a theist could say something there, and this gets into a person's views on the nature of time.
Mhm.
Atheist or beer theorist, and we can't get into that today. But then, of course, God's relation to time.
Yeah.
So Craig, you brought him up, so I'll mention him. His view is something, unless he's changed it, has been typically that God, he'll say, without creation or without the world, not before, without the world, sans, that's Latin for without. Uh, Without it is timeless, right? There is no time. But then once he makes the decision to bring about the world, like
Mhm.
you said, space and time come into being at
Mhm.
the Big Bang. And in his view, which is controversial to some, God is no longer uh, timeless. He's omnitemporal or something like this. He experiences the passage of time.
Mhm.
But a theist might say something as well that, it strikes me that, maybe, uh, God is, could be, you know some theists refer to God as everlasting, or this sort of thing. So maybe omnitemporality is in place prior to the universe coming into existence, and why that might matter to these kinds of theists would be that, um, God thinks thoughts, he makes decisions to actualize the world, he arrives at that decision somehow. He made a decision, at least in the Judeo-Christian tradition, to become incarnated in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, and that is divine and human nature, let's say, being united in some way, which we can't get into today, in time, right? So these are interesting, thorny questions, but so you have to have some kind of something to say here, not only for sort of the whether there's a God question reasons, but
Mhm.
I think theists about these other issues depending on their theological commitments. But all that to say is, it's not at all obvious to me that you'd have to say take a timelessness view where there's no time, or no sense of time without the universe. Uh, but that again depends on a person, how someone teases that out. So just now bringing it full circle back to where we're at.
Mhm.
Uh, uh, without the universe, there, I think I'm just postulating that there could be time. Uh, that's a controversial view. I think a standard view for many theists, not all,
Mhm.
is that is something like Craig's view that God is at least timeless without the universe, and maybe then for those in you know, I would say probably Muslims and certain people in the Judeo-Christian tradition, he continues to be timeless. So he's independent of the universe. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, I would say I think it just depends how you tease it all out, and I
Yeah.
think it's a question that would require some kind of teasing out for both theists and non-theists alike if they want to posit the material cause.
Hmm. So I think one can even just, I mean, an interest in time, we should probably move on. But I guess just to lastly, as far as like the material halls, I was just curious about like if you can supplement certain principles and see where they go, and then
Yeah, yeah, sure.
about certain
That's
commitments.
a great question. Yeah.
The second one was more about like causation itself. If someone has a view of causation that's spatio-temporal, like I said, and those are relations between two events, is it meaningful even to say that there's a cause or prior cause to the universe if that's when space and time began after? Which I'm not. It's unclear to me. I mean, I haven't studied enough of philosophy of causation because I know there's quite a bit of different views out there. I don't even know if that's a standard of mine, a standard of view of causation about that it's a spatial temporal relation between two events. But if that's the case, then it would seem to rule out like there wouldn't be a cause of the universe. Um, or yeah, I think that I feel like that would be kind of at least tension between saying if that there is a cause.
Okay, so one more time, I want to make sure I'm tracking you.
Mm.
There wouldn't be a cause of the universe if.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is that if I view, so let's say when I say that one event causes another event, um, the when we're looking at the event itself, there are certain elements or properties we can say. There's the event A and event B, and
Mhm.
then not only is there an event A and event B, but it's involved in space and involved in time. So there's a time spatial relationship between the two. And what
Okay.
I'm saying is that if the Big Bang from there on is that's when space and time like space. So here's Big Bang, and then from the right of myself is space and time, and cause and effect resides in this area. What I'm saying is that if this view of causation is true, then this area over here on the left side there is no cause or effect because time doesn't exist there.
I see. I see.
And so what I'm saying is that could there even be a cause of something if there is no cause and effect here and it happens after the fact?
Yeah, and I
So
would say, yeah, that depends on whether you think, you know. Um,
your view on
I'm
causation.
sorry if I'm sorry if I got muddied down there in my previous response, but if well, there are two things that I want to say here. One is the if you think you said events causing other events. So one thing about causation here, uh, some people believe that that's the only kind of causation there is. Event A causes event B. So that one way I think to come at uh, back to what you're saying is to say, well, there are other kinds of causes,
Hmm.
the agent or personal causes, and so maybe a personal cause can bring about an event without the requirement for there to be time. If it's the kind of being that doesn't have to occupy space and is beyond time or is timeless. So that I think, and again, that's I'm putting that conditionally. Uh, but I think the deeper issue without the time stuff there is just in general. You could have a universe coming into being because it's not an event that brings it about, but an agent, a being, and that's part of what's going on in this argument. The necessary cause, I believe, is an agent, right? Is a person, because you're not going to have an event, a contingent event, be able to account for the universe coming to be. And this argument that I gave doesn't. It's fine that we're talking about the Big Bang, but it doesn't rely on
Yeah.
that per se or a commitment to a particular view of time or that sort of thing. But I think that's generally how I would kind of
Yeah.
respond to that. Did that make sense? I don't
Yeah,
really.
I mean, there's definitely room for disagreement there because, and then
Yeah,
it's
sure.
like, well, it's just the yeah time and space, and then how does that relate to causation between events? And so, but anyway, I don't want to get bogged down onto
Yeah,
philosophy of
yeah, let me move.
causation.
Yeah, let
That's
me move on to one more objection, if that's okay with you, in the
yes.
interest of time. The third objection is one that comes from philosophers like Immanuel Kant Richard Gale, and they kind of go after the conclusion of the argument being contradictory. And how so? Well, they think that this idea of a necessary being is inconceivable. It's problematic. Why is it problematic? Well, they hear necessary being, and they're hearing that as in the neighborhood or akin to a concept that comes up in another theistic argument called the ontological argument, where it relies on this idea of there being a maximally excellent being or a greatest possible being or a being of which no greater can be conceived or something like this. And so the ontological argument happens to be an argument that philosophers, both atheist and non-theist alike, tend to not find favor with. Some like it, or some version of it. But so the argument, the line of argument here is that, well, if the ontological argument is suspect, and let's say we think it is, to the degree that this contingency argument relies on it or is smuggling it in, so to speak, well, then the contingency argument is sketchy too, because it's got this problematic idea of a necessary being that's doing the work to drive the argument and get us to the idea that God is the necessary being that explains the universe. Okay, here are a couple responses. I think the central response here is that there's a confusion that Kant and Gale are confusing two kinds of necessity: logical necessity and ontological necessity, or metaphysical necessity. Okay, what's the difference? Logical necessity is the idea that something is logically undeniable. It can't be false, or something like this. Once you understand logically the kind of thing it is, or you see the logic, you can't deny it. Ontological necessity is to say that we need this sort of thing to exist to explain another thing. And that's very different. Okay. You could logically deny the thing that is being said to be necessary to exist to explain what we're trying to explain. And so those two things pull apart. In other words, you could have ontological necessity and deny logical necessity. And that's what I'm doing, let's say, or the proponent of this argument is doing. They're saying what we're talking about in the argument is ontological necessity. That is to say, we have to have a being that's a necessary being that exists to fully account for the contingent universe. That's different than saying that we need a logically undeniable being. That's not what's being communicated in the argument. That may be what's being communicated in the ontological argument, but that's something for another day, as we say. So what's going on here is that, and what I believe is that we need a necessary being that's real to fully, adequately account for the existence of the universe, why we have a universe at all. And so what I think a way to tie this all together is a necessary being, again, is a being that can't not exist, right? It has to exist to fully account for why we have this universe, or any universe for that matter. And so the idea of a necessary being isn't self-contradictory. It's not intrinsically impossible. It's plausible, it's meaningful. And I think when we explore, as we have, some of the responses to Hume and Bertrand Russell, I'm not convinced anyways that we can appeal to either parts of the universe or all the parts of the universe to adequately account for the universe as a whole, number one. And so if that's the case, then we need a necessary being. And I think the best kind of candidate for a necessary being that could bring about this universe, this kind of universe, is going to be a personal one. Why is that the case? Let me just pop up a couple things, and then you're welcome to push back. The God of the Judeo-Christian tradition, let's say, or at least even of the monotheism, but especially in the Judeo-Christian traditions, is that you have a being that, and again, we're appealing to, what I'm doing here is to invoke some of this being's attributes to provide an explanation. And this isn't giving further reasons to believe in the being. Okay, the argument is the reason to believe in this being, but this being is eternal, right? It is a being who doesn't begin and end. That's what eternality means. It's a being that acts for reasons, that is has sufficient knowledge to act for reasons, and this sort of thing. It has sufficient power to act for the reasons that it has. It's a being of intentionality. And so when we look around the universe, that we find ourselves in, and we try to account for it, that kind of being the necessary being in question, can provide a full, adequate explanation for the universe that we have, where there are other intentional, personal beings that aren't eternal, right? That are finite and limited in power and creativity and all the rest of it. But it explains those things fully in a way that just giving, as you said earlier, naturalistic explanations. They can do a lot of work, but they can't do all the work that we need to explain the why. They can tell us the what, but not the why they're here in the first place, or why we have this universe that allows for these kinds of beings to exist. Number two, when we've explained the universe in terms of this personal necessary being and its conscious intentions, I think we've reached a full, complete explanation. We have great explanatory power. We don't have as much explanatory power, even if we grant Hume, as we did earlier, that you can explain some contingent things by explaining their parts, or explaining parts of the universe. I think we can go a great distance, but we don't have a full, satisfying explanation of the universe as a whole. Now, someone might say, well, what about Occam's razor? Are we multiplying explanatory entities beyond what's necessary? And I think that's a good question. And my answer is, well, no. If we need this if we need this necessary being to have a full, adequate explanation of the whole thing, of the universe and why we have this universe, then you can't, to shave it away, right? To shave away this necessary being would be actually to give up something that's explanatorily necessary to provide a intellectually satisfying account of the universe. So we would lose some explanatory power, in other words. Number three, I think appealing to a necessary personal God, let's say, as an intentional moral agent, let's say, leads us to expect certain kinds of things about the kind of universe that we would be looking for this being to bring about, like a comprehensible one, an interesting one, a beautiful one, and a meaningful one. And we could add to that. And I think when we look around our universe, and we're constantly, I've led whole seminars or classes on the meaning of life. This is a deeply interesting and important question for how to live, and why people would have children, or why you would raise your children a certain way, or why you pick a career that you pick, etc. I think those sorts of questions about meaning and human meaning and purpose are we would expect to have those sorts of questions in a universe, and expect to find answers to them in a universe where we have a necessary personal being such as God. But in a universe without such a being, not only is it really hard to find a satisfying answer to those questions, oftentimes we find people, especially on the meaning question, wanting to go the route of nihilism or some kind of subjectivism that leads into problems that we can maybe discuss on another episode. Number four, last but not least, I think having God as the necessary being that explains the contingent universe, I think can provide a simpler explanation than some of the contingent naturalistic explanations that we've even talked about today, or others offer. Now, that requires, I think, more development than we have time to get into today, but people like Richard Swinburne and others have tried to argue for that in places. And I'm sympathetic to that. I think God, far from being a complex explanation, is actually a simpler explanation when you kind of detail some of the central features or attributes, like God being eternal and God being loving and wise and acting for reasons and this sort of thing. I think gives us a simpler explanation for the kind of universe that we find ourselves in, and why it's here in the first place, rather than why it wouldn't be here. So feel free to follow any of that up, press on any of that, raise objections. And
one question that I do have is going back to the conclusion of the argument that there's at least one necessary being, and that necessary being would be God, and reasons for that are kind of the attributes that we've kind of I don't know, like a better word, deduced in some sense about what this being would be like. So my question goes into a little bit of about God and granting everything so far, God creating two different worlds, and choosing to instantiate one world rather than another world, right? So God being free of choice, kind of having libertarian free will in the way that he's undetermined. And so God has two worlds in front of him, and essentially, and he instantiates one over another one. Um, Now, what would be the explanation of what would you say the explanation between the two would be? And like kind of like, well, why that world rather than another world? Because it certainly seems right intuitively, without giving like I don't have a full fledged argument against this or anything, but it's like the world kind of seems like it could be a little bit better. I think
Oh, sure. Yeah.
people have argued, people probably could argue that it could be better. So God choosing to instantiate this world
Right.
rather than another world. Do you think that would posit some type of bruteness there, or like kind of leave open a little bit more explanation about, well, why this world rather than another world?
Okay, first let me just mention a couple options in answering this, and then I'll tell you kind of where I lean.
Sure.
I will say for the record, this is hugely speculative.
Yes.
so,
Sure.
but I find this to be an interesting question, and one of my most favorite non-theistic philosophers, William Rowe,
Hmm.
did some really interesting work on this. He has a book, Can God Be Free? And he just, I'll put this out there because this would be maybe something you could have someone else on, or I'd be happy to come back on to talk about these kinds of things. But he brought up the tension similar to you detailed it. But let's suppose you posit you believe that God is free. He doesn't have to do any, he has free will. Okay, let's say. You said libertarian free. So if you grant that, a theist believes that, but let's suppose you also believe that God is good. He's morally perfect, and so he wants to use and will use his freedom to do what's best. The question is something like, well, we look at the world we're in, surely, and if you add to that he's omnipotent and can, he has maximal power, couldn't he have made a better world than the one we find ourselves in, or is this the best of all possible worlds? Someone will ask, and this seems to put theists, maybe like myself, in a certain kind of corner. Okay, I think it's a fascinating and great question, and this is going to be far too brief than it deserves. But for now, there are kind of two or three moves people make. Some theists will say, you got people like Leibniz who will argue that this is the best of all possible worlds, and then they'll have to say more of why that's the case. But he'll say this is the best, at least maybe to achieve the goals that God has, the ends that He has, and in there's going to have to be other details that get into questions related to the problem of evil and suffering and the Odyssey and this sort of thing, where God's given other agents free will, not just Himself. So, namely us, and
Hmm.
maybe if there are other moral agents like angels and this sort of thing that have free will. Okay, that all would have to get into that sort of discussion, figure into that kind of answer. So this is the best possible world, is one answer. Another is that answer is um, that there are multiple worlds, and you said something like this, but maybe there's multiple worlds that God could choose from to with His free will. He could select to actualize, bring about, or create to further his divine ends, his good ends for the universe, and uh, but it's not that this is the best one and this is a lesser one, and there's maybe another one over there he could have selected. So like William Rowe raised things like, well, even if there was one less tyrant like Hitler, it would be a better world. Okay, the answer is, well, maybe what we have is there are multiple what are called incommensurable worlds. So they're all, if you will, equally good. And given that God, and they'd have to be sufficiently similar to the one we're in, let's say, right, where there are other moral agents that can do bad things to make the world bad.
Hmm.
So it's not that on this account that God brings about a bad world. It's that God initially makes a world as good as He can make it, but He puts other beings in it,
Hmm.
moral agents in it, that have the freedom to muck it up.
Hmm.
But the range of those worlds, I'm going to make up a number. Let's say there are 10 of those. They're all on par with each other. So maybe one of the 10 includes someone like me, and so I only muck it up a certain amount. But world 2 doesn't include me, but there's someone else sufficiently like me that wouldn't drastically change the balance of good and bad in world 2 compared to world 1. So you couldn't say, well, he should have made world 2, or he should have made world 1 and made it with Chad, or without Chad, let's say. And so what you do there is, in saying that they're incommensurable worlds, and this is a common move. My doctoral advisor, I think, at least at the time I was studying with him, had a view similar to this. Would say, well, yeah, there isn't a better possible world. It's just that there are multiple worlds that God could pick from, and there are maybe reasons that we're not privy to since we're human, that He has for selecting this one over one of those other ones. But it's not because this is the better than the other ones. It's just it's one of the many good worlds He could have actualized, and so He selected this one. And then you still have to fill in all the details about, why there's bad stuff that arises in this world, and so on. But that's all I think for today. I can articulate in the interest of time. But yeah, I think it's a great question. It's an interesting one.
Yeah. Just before we close out, do you have any recommendations for anyone interested in reading philosophy of religion or reading about God's existence, for and against?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many great resources. I think for those who are interested in this, I think it depends on your level of reading. So I'm going to speak in generalities here. Like I recommend to my students and my classes, I think if you're interested in the God question, you do yourself a good service to pick up something like maybe a philosophy of religion anthology. Excuse me. There, an anthology of readings. Rutledge has philosophy of religion. In fact, some of the stuff I'm taking today from the argument I'm actually expressing is from Bruce Reichenbach. I should have mentioned that at the beginning. I'm sorry that I didn't mention his name, but it's from an anthology that he had a paper in. He did a lot of work on the different versions of the cosmological argument, and so that it appears in an anthology, I think, in the Blackwell or Rutledge. I think it was Blackwell. I'm sorry, Blackwell Companion to Philosophy of Religion. And there have been many versions of that, and those tend to get updated every few years. And you can find those on Amazon used for pretty inexpensive. And what's good about that is you'll find you'll find stuff on both sides of any of these discussions. So you'll find pushbacks. I think if you're interested in the cosmological argument, there are lots of versions you can read. Some from people that are sympathetic to the thinking of Thomas Aquinas, so Thomistic then this one is not that. There's a thinker by the name of Ed Feser who has done some recent work on that kind of argument, cosmological. There's the Kalam cosmological argument. You mentioned William Lane Craig. He's got lots of, you can go on his website or you can go on Ed Feser's website and you can find their papers. And then you can Google them and you'll find the papers of people responding to them. I think that's one way to go about it. But I think starting with an anthology is good too, because you not only get arguments for and against God's existence, you can go further into other tensions like Jacob you're raising here at the end that get into what are called coherence of theism objections to theism, which are like, is the notion of God even coherent? And so you can get some of those. You get papers on the topics related to faith and reason issues, like how do we even know God exists? Can we know God's existence through arguments or not? Or reason and faith in tension, or science and faith in tension? And so you get those sorts of papers on different sides of those issues that I think are really good to think through. I'm very interested in questions related to religious experience issues, which tie into how you have knowledge of God. And there are people critiquing that. Cognitive science of religion stuff is really kind of hot these days. And so you can find those in anthologies, but I think those are kind of good places to start. And then you'll get to know who's who, and then you can find their books where they write whole books on their defending their view and that sort of thing. So.
Perfect. And one final question was, given that this topic can get very personal for some people, I tend to refrain from having conversations in general about like this kind of stuff, just because it can get very hot. It's like political conversations. Sure. How would you say going about the best way to kind of to talk about these issues or to talk about these topics with people that you do find disagreement with? Yeah.
Wonderful question. And I'll just say again, one of the reasons I appreciate you and this podcast is the spirit with which it's done. That's why I've come on multiple times, and we've talked about stuff like this, I think, outside of the podcast. And so what I'm about to say, I think would apply to political discussions too. I operate from the conviction that it's possible to have reasonable disagreement with people that we consider to be intellectual peers or people that we, family or friends that we value. And I think it's important kind of as a starting place for a person to really value that, have that conviction. And I also think it's important to start from a place where I value the person I'm going to engage, and I see them as a human person. And that may seem silly to say, but I think it, and I'm saying this for myself too. If I find myself getting worked up, it's not just because the topic's personal. It's probably, if I'm honest, and this is hard, right? I have to take a hard look inside. It's probably because I'm starting to verge on either feeling insecure about my position, or I'm tending to see you as not as worthy of my consideration, or your views worthy of my consideration, and that quickly bleeds into seeing you beneath me. And so I think um, I too, even with professional philosophers, I will only enter these discussions if I'm convinced that the other person, the other party, is willing to start there, and I'm in a good place to have the discussion. So I think you got to have some internal checks and balances on yourself, and don't just project it all on the other person. I mean, own it yourself, and work on yourself if you need to. So I'd say don't get in the discussions if you don't think you can respect the other person, and really go in with a desire to hear what they have to say. So reasonable disagreement, respect for the other person, and then I think it's important even just to, when you approach the discussion, even maybe set some ground rules if you're worried that you or the other person, you know yourself and you know them, that you might even know their buttons that get pushed, right? So just say, hey, look, I've been thinking about this. I'm really curious what you think about this. I sense that we maybe have some disagreement about it, but I want to hear what you have to say, and I'd really like a chance to ask you some questions. Are you comfortable with that? And I want you to know that I'm comfortable with you pressing back. I really just want to have a healthy dialogue. And I think if you start there with a person, in my experience, probably 9 times out of 10, most people will live up to that, because I think most people want a chance to articulate their view, and they want to be able to do that in a context that's not threatening to them. And I can say that in 15 years or so of teaching at the college level, when I say this in my classes, which you know from having me as a student, I find that people rise to the occasion, and they want that, and they'll do that. And again, there are going to be uncomfortable places. There's going to be cognitive dissonance. There's going to be places where I have to ask for clarification because I misinterpret you and you misinterpret me. But that's just, we got to understand and accept that that's part of the human space, right? Of dialogue and disagreement. And so I think if people will be committed to that, I think they'll find that they can have really fruitful discussions, and then be willing to give yourself and the other person space to, if you feel like it's just ramping up in a way that's uncomfortable, just be willing to say that and say, hey, like, look, I don't want this to go in a bad way, in a bad direction. Why don't we pause it there for today, and let's come back together at a future point. And that's okay. And I think any conversation, I've had to learn that too. It's not about being right. It's about seeking the truth. And I think we have to hold ourselves to that standard of, we're seeking the truth together. We're partners in the journey together. It's not about defeating the other person. And I think what you get on the internet, unfortunately, is this: people want to defeat each other and declare winners. And if that's where you're trying to go, you're just gonna get frustrated and angry really often and really easily. So
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think? I'm curious what you think on this. I mean, I
Yeah.
think
No,
you do a good job of leading us in this, but I mean,
yeah.
what's your take on it?
No, I totally agree. There's not much I really disagree with. It's just, again, kind of what you're talking about. You really have to. I really like when you're saying setting the boundaries for the discussion, um, because oftentimes, um, like I said, it can get personal at times, and then kind of what you're saying, like when you're kind of honest with yourself a little bit, it's just like you're feeling insecure about something, and so you kind of go on the offensive, and you start kind of being forceful or attacking, or like why, or making maybe certain comments. I know I've done that in the past too. Um, but I like setting the ground rules, and then kind of going into like, hey, look, this is just what I just want to talk to you about this, and like, what do you think about this?
Mm.
Um, I think it does take some self-control and some like introspection about, like, why am I having this conversation in the first place with this person? And so I have found myself a lot more to be selective with conversations that I have with people, just because I've just past experience being with them. Like, this conversation is not going to go very well. So certain conversations or certain topics I just completely avoid, just because I can see where it's going. But one conversation I had brought in recently with a family member was more of like, hey, look, I want to tell you this about my position, where I'm at, kind of like, so for example, My family is very, religious. I grew up religious too, and we shared about this. But my commitments now have changed, and I hope that my bias isn't really reflected in our conversation. I know where my commitments are, and as I continue to develop my own thinking of things, they start to sway a little bit and move.
Sure.
But for the most part, I have where I stand. And then, so I had this conversation with a family member, and that's kind of how I wanted the conversation to go. Like, hey, look, I just want to explain to you, because we haven't talked about this in years, and I just want to explain to you where I'm at. And in some sense, I felt frustrated, but in another sense, I felt like, okay, at least I got out what I wanted to say, and it wasn't like I was trying to win. It's more of just like, hey, like this is just what I think right now, and of course, it might change in 5 years, in 10 years. I don't know.
Yeah.
My positions in general are very tentative,
Yeah. Yeah.
based off of new information I get
Yeah.
and how I process things. So,
Yeah. No, that's great. I think there's deep wisdom in knowing when to refrain from engaging and when to walk away in a respectful way. Uh, and again, there's wisdom in approaching these things as long term. Like I like what you said there at the end of like this could change in 5 years. And so again, I think it goes back to the humanity of if I really care about you as a person, I'm going to be okay with the fact that we're not trying to settle it today.
mhm,
Uh, that might be something that'd be nice if we were on the same page on whatever the topic is. But again, if we're really committed to seeking truth and again having a relationship, you and I, as we're seeking truth,
mhm,
we got to have a long, be able to take a long view. And I think, I mean, I had to learn this too, and I probably am still learning in different ways. But I think if I find myself getting frustrated, it's probably because I'm trying too hard
mhm,
to
mhm,
be right or win, as to just doing what you said, which is like, here's where I'm at. I'd like to have a discussion with you about it. Where are you at?
yeah.
And then just being okay with that and not feeling like, hey, we've got to move each other from A to B today.
Yeah.
Uh, And
It's
so,
hard. It's hard, especially. I mean, there's also background baggage and for like
of
just
course,
prior experience. It's hard for me to hear someone out sometimes, especially or try to validate them. Where it's like I want to go and I just want to convince you why I'm right and why you're wrong. That's kind of sometimes like majority of the time or times where it has been like that. And so
yeah,
and then when there's history between people where I've been like that, it makes it even more kind of combative whenever we're talking about a topic that we may have disagreement with, because then it's like those assumptions are being drawn back in, and it's like, well, hold on, I'm trying to be different, or let's just move on from that or something like
yeah,
that.
yeah.
It's tough,
Very good, very
but
good.
perfect. Thanks for coming back on the podcast, Chad. It was a really good conversation, and I hope to have more.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and I hope it's interesting and helpful to some people. And it's always a joy to engage with you. So thanks so much.